Time seemed to pass as Daniel remained in the hospital, pretending to still be unconscious. Every second was a struggle between the weakness of his body and the fury that grew in his mind. He knew he couldn't stay in that state for long. He needed to act, but how could he escape, weakened and without resources? The answer came from where he least expected it. One morning, while the hospital routine was going on as usual, a nurse entered the room. She had a familiar face, although Daniel couldn't immediately identify it. Her name was Natalie, a young nurse who seemed more attentive than the other staff. His stance was firm, but his touch when adjusting the equipment around Daniel was careful and gentle. He could tell, through the small opening of her half-closed eyes, that there was something different about her, something that set her apart from the rest. Days passed, and Natalie continued her meticulous work. Daniel watched her every move cautiously, trying to understand if he could trust her. So one night, while Natalie was making her nightly rounds, he decided to take a chance. With an almost superhuman effort, he whispered, "Natalie." She froze, her eyes wide with surprise. "Are you awake?" His voice was low, as if he was afraid someone might hear. Daniel gave a slight nod. "Please. I need your help. Don't tell anyone." Natalie hesitated for a moment, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She knew how dangerous it was to keep a secret like that. But there was something in Daniel's gaze, an urgency, a truth she couldn't ignore. After all, something about the situation of that man, who was supposed to be unconscious, always seemed strange to him. "Tell me what's going on," she finally said, her voice controlled. Daniel took a deep breath, struggling to find the strength to explain. "My wife. Clara, she's planning something. She wants my fortune. She's with a lover. I heard everything. I don't know the details, but I know my life is in danger. I need to get out of here." Natalie blinked in disbelief as she tried to take in what Daniel had just said. What seemed like a fictional story was, in fact, unfolding before their eyes. She knew it would help, she couldn't just ignore the man's desperate plea. "You are still weak. If we try to leave now, they'll notice." "We need a plan," Natalie said, with a gleam of determination in her eyes. Daniel, feeling he finally had a chance to escape, agreed. The alliance was formed, an unlikely partnership between a betrayed man and a nurse who barely knew him. Over the next few days, Natalie began quietly working on a plan to get Daniel out of the hospital, little by little, strengthening him for what was to come. Natalie knew it wouldn't be easy. Even with the quietest nights at the hospital, there was always the risk of someone noticing what she and Daniel were up to. She began helping Daniel with small nightly physical therapy sessions, moving him from his hospital bed to taking small steps. Every movement was painful for him, but over time, his body began to respond. Each night, they increased the challenge, always keeping an eye out for empty hallways and distant noises. Meanwhile, Daniel felt his strength return. The simple act of getting out of bed felt like a small triumph. With Natalie's help, he was slowly regaining control over his body and mind. More importantly, he was forming a strategy. He couldn't just run away, he needed to get back what was his and prepare to confront Clara and the man who had betrayed him. One day, as Natalie was changing the sheets on her bed, she leaned over and whispered, "I got a driver. He's a trusted friend of mine, no one will suspect. But you will need a few more days. It's almost time." Daniel nodded, knowing that this was his only chance to escape this hell. Each day, he focused on hiding his progress from the doctors and nurses. No one but Natalie could suspect he was conscious, and any mistake could be fatal. Clara, until then, remained absent. She visited him from time to time, just to confirm that he was still unconscious, always without showing any real emotion. But Daniel knew his time was running out. She couldn't keep up the charade for long before making a drastic decision. The planned night finally arrived. The hospital was quieter than usual, the lights were off and the hallways were empty. Natalie appeared in the room with clothes for Daniel, replacing the hospital gown he was wearing. Adrenaline was running through his veins, and although his body was still weak, he was determined. Carefully, Natalie helped him move down the hall, pushing a wheelchair. The footsteps were silent, eyes alert for any sign of movement. As they reached the emergency exit, the cold night air enveloped them, and for the first time in weeks, Daniel breathed deeply, feeling the taste of freedom. The driver was waiting for them outside, ready to take them to Daniel's house, a place that, he knew, would never be the same. The car sped along the winding road that led back to Daniel Rivers' house. The lights of the city of Aspen became distant on the horizon, while the cold wind from the mountains penetrated through the glass of the half-open window. Daniel, sitting in the back seat, looked at the landscape without really seeing it. His mind was in a whirlwind of emotions, but one thing was certain: he needed a plan. Natalie, sitting next to him, remained silent, observing Daniel's restlessness. I knew he was dealing with much more than just physical recovery. His body, still weak, shook with the effort of keeping himself upright, but the determination in Daniel's eyes was unshakable. When they arrived at Daniel's house, he found himself faced with a vision that hit him like a punch in the stomach. The lights were on, and through the front window, he could see Clara's silhouette and the man who now inhabited the place that was once her refuge. Anger bubbled up inside him, but he held it in, fighting to remain calm. "She changed the locks," Daniel murmured, his voice low and bitter. The driver parked a distance away so they wouldn't be noticed, and Daniel took a deep breath. Now it's real. Natalie placed her hand on Daniel's shoulder, offering silent support. "Let's go in carefully, we can't rush in. You're not strong enough to confront them yet, Daniel." He knew she was right, but the thought of being so close and yet powerless was eating him up inside. Clara had taken not only his house, but also everything he had built over the years. Everything seemed to fall apart around him, but he no longer had a choice. I needed to act strategically. "I'm going to the door," Daniel said, more to himself than to Natalie. He forced himself out of the car, leaning on the cane Natalie had gotten him. His steps were slow, but his mind was focused on the next move. As he approached the door, his heartbeat accelerated. He rang the doorbell firmly. Inside, he heard footsteps approaching. When the door opened, it was not Clara who appeared, but rather the man she had brought into her home, a face Daniel barely recognized, but whose presence filled him with contempt. "Who are you?" the man said arrogantly, frowning. "You shouldn't be here." Before Daniel could respond, Clara appeared behind the man. When she saw him, her expression turned into pure shock, as if she had seen a ghost. "Daniel," his voice was broken, a mix of fear and surprise. How? "I'm not dead, Clara," Daniel replied, controlled anger in his voice. "We have a lot to talk about." The air was heavy in the small living room. Clara remained paralyzed for a few seconds, while the man next to her took a step forward, trying to impose his presence. Daniel, despite being weakened, kept his gaze steady. "You have 5 minutes to leave my house, Clara. Take what's yours and leave, you and your friend," said Daniel, in a dry tone. The man, visibly uncomfortable, tried to react. "Look, you should get out of here. This isn't your house anymore. Clara and I." "This is my house," Daniel interrupted, without looking away. "And I'm not going anywhere. Unless you want to find out what happens when someone pushes their owner to the limit." Daniel's tone wasn't aggressive, but there was a firmness to his words that left no room for argument. The man hesitated, but Clara, who was beginning to realize how much the situation was out of her control, grabbed his arm. "Let's go," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defeat. With no other choice, Clara and her lover quickly collected some clothes and belongings. Daniel's gaze never left the two of them as they walked out the door, carrying makeshift suitcases. Clara's betrayal still weighed heavily on Daniel's heart, but at that moment, he didn't let the emotion dominate him. When the door finally closed behind them, Daniel collapsed onto the couch, his body shaking with exhaustion. Reality hit him hard. Clara had betrayed his trust in a way he could never imagine. Not only had she stolen his heart, but she had also tried to steal everything he had built. And barely, she almost made it. Natalie silently entered the room and sat down next to Daniel. "You did what you needed to do," she said, her voice soft and understanding. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "This is just the beginning. I need answers. Clara wasn't acting alone, and I won't rest until I know who else was involved. She had something to do with the accident, I feel it." Natalie nodded. "I'll help you with whatever you need. But you need time to recover. This isn't over yet." Daniel knew she was right. Although he had managed to get Clara out of her home, the real battle was yet to come. He would need strength, allies and, above all, proof. And to do that, he needed the help of someone who could investigate Clara's past and discover how involved she was in her near death. "I know who can help us," Daniel said, his eyes full of determination. "Marco. He's a private detective, a trustworthy guy. If there's dirt in Clara's past, he'll find out." Natalie smiled, relieved to see that Daniel was starting to regain control. "Then let's go after him." Daniel Rivers has always been a man of simple ambitions, but with a singular talent for transforming the ordinary into something extraordinary. Owner of a chain of cozy cafes spread across the mountains of Colorado, he built his small empire with dedication and a vision that went beyond coffee. For him, every cup served was an opportunity to create memories, and his business was more than a source of income, it was a reflection of his passion for connecting people. His stores weren't just coffee shops, they were refuges where tourists and locals could escape the intense cold and isolation of the mountains. Each of their units had a personal touch, with cozy fireplaces, rustic wooden tables, and incredible views of the snow-capped mountains. Aspen, in particular, was Daniel's crown jewel. He always considered this city a second home, where wild beauty and tranquility were in perfect harmony. But behind the warm smile and apparent success, Daniel struggled with the challenges that had been accumulating in his personal life. Clara, his wife, an ambitious woman with whom he had shared his life for more than a decade, had become a distant and cold presence. What was once a partnership seems to have turned into a silent competition, with Clara involved in dubious real estate investments and projects that she kept hidden from Daniel. He had always trusted her, never imagining that Clara could be capable of something darker. Daniel's lonely nights became more frequent, as she made up excuses to go out, always claiming to be busy with work. In his heart, Daniel began to feel that something was deeply wrong, but he never wanted to believe that his own wife could cheat on him. Fate, however, is merciless to those who ignore the signs. That fateful night, Daniel was on a winding road leading down from the mountains of Aspen. The snow was falling heavily, and his thoughts were confused, a storm of emotions that mirrored the weather outside. He had followed Clara to a luxury hotel in the city. His suspicions finally led him to confront the painful truth: Clara was seeing another man. There she was, laughing, holding hands with a stranger in the lobby, not caring about the world around her. Daniel's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. He didn't know where to drive, so he just sped up, his mind lost in the pain of betrayal. The last thing he remembered was the headlights of a car coming towards him and then the brutal impact that threw him against the steering wheel. The world around him blurred, the sound of twisting metal and crunching snow mixing with the sound of his own breathing, slow and ragged. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer on the road. The darkness around him was filled only by the distant sound of machines and continuous beeping. His vision was blurry, but he realized he was in a hospital room. His body felt like lead, heavy and immobile, as his mind struggled to understand what had happened. It was then that he heard her voice. Clara was there, next to his bed, and the sound of their phone conversation hit him like a knife. "Yes, dear, everything is under control. His fortune will be ours once everything is resolved." Her voice was cold, distant, without the slightest trace of remorse. Daniel could hardly believe what he was hearing. Pretending to be unconscious, he kept his eyes closed, fighting the terror that was growing inside him. She was planning something much worse than just betrayal. She was plotting to take everything he had built. As she hung up the phone and left the room, Daniel found himself overcome with a new emotion, anger. It wasn't just the pain of betrayal, but the fury of having been the target of such a cruel plan. He needed to act, but at that moment, his body still didn't respond to his mind. He was trapped in his own weakness, but determined to take back everything that was his. Now, he knew who Clara really was, and he knew he needed a way out. "I just didn't know how, yet." The sun was rising behind the mountains, casting a soft light on Daniel's house. But inside, he felt that he was far from finding peace. The last 24 hours had been a whirlwind. Recovering his home was a first step, but he knew that Clara did not act alone. The accident, the plans to steal his fortune, everything pointed to a larger conspiracy. And to unravel it, he would need help. After a bad night's sleep, Daniel finally made the decision to contact Marco, Aspen's private detective. Marco was a former police officer, known for his coldness and precision. Daniel knew that if anyone could discover the secrets that Clara was hiding, it was Marco. Natalie, as always, was by his side, helping him organize the next steps. "Are you sure he's the right person for this?" she asked, as Daniel typed Marco's number into his phone. "Marco is the best. If there's something Clara is hiding, he'll find out," Daniel replied, his voice firm, but his face still reflecting the tiredness of weeks of tension. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered on the other end. "Marco speaking." "It's Daniel Rivers," Daniel said bluntly. "I need your help." There was a short pause, followed by a sigh. "Daniel, I heard about your accident. I thought you were in a coma." "I was," Daniel replied, not wanting to dwell too much on the details. "I need you to investigate Clara. Something is very wrong. I'm sure she was involved in my accident, but I need proof." "Meet me in my office in an hour," Marco said without hesitation. He had always been direct and focused, and that was exactly what Daniel needed at that moment. An hour later, Daniel and Natalie were in the car, driving along the roads of Aspen toward Marco's office. The detective operated out of a small, inconspicuous building, far from the city's busy center. When they arrived, Marco was already waiting for them in the waiting room, his expression impassive. "Come in," he said, motioning for them both to sit down. The office was simple, with a dark wooden table, a few chairs and a shelf full of files. Marco, with his gray hair and sharp gaze, exuded experience and pragmatism. Daniel quickly explained the situation: Clara's betrayal, her lover, the car accident, and his suspicions that Clara had orchestrated everything to take his fortune. Marco listened attentively, without interrupting, taking notes from time to time. "She has changed drastically in the last few months," Daniel said. "At first I thought it was the marriage that was wearing thin, but then I realized she was planning something bigger. The nights out, the lies, and now, after waking up in the hospital and hearing her voice on the phone, I know that was right." Marco nodded slowly. "If Clara was involved in your accident, I will find the evidence. I will start by investigating her car records, her contacts, and any financial transactions that could indicate a conspiracy." Daniel breathed a sigh of relief. He knew that Marco's help was crucial to revealing the whole truth. "And how long will this take?" he asked. "That depends on what we find," Marco replied, making no promises. "But I can guarantee that I won't stop until I have something concrete." The days that followed were pure tension for Daniel. Marco was investigating, but uncertainty consumed him. Every sound, every phone that rang, made him fear the worst. Clara and her lover were gone, and Daniel knew that once things started to unravel, they would do everything they could to protect themselves. On one of these anxious nights, Natalie, noticing Daniel's distress, sat next to him in the living room. "You need to rest," she said softly. "If it continues like this, it will wear out before Marco has time to do his work." "I know," Daniel replied, massaging his temples, "but it's hard. With each passing day, I feel like I'm further from the truth." "What are they planning now? Are they going to try to get me out of the way again?" Natalie placed her hand over his. "We're in this together. You've already been through the worst, Daniel. Now it's only a matter of time before we have answers." The next morning, the phone finally rang. It was Marco. "Daniel, I have something for you." Marco's voice was calm, but it carried a weight that Daniel couldn't ignore. He quickly prepared himself and went to the detective's office, his heart racing with anxiety. When he arrived, Marco already had a folder of documents on the table. He motioned for Daniel to sit down. "I discovered some interesting things," the detective began, opening the folder. "First, I found bank records that show money transfers from Clara to an account in her lover's name, made shortly after your accident. It seems they were hoping you wouldn't survive." Daniel felt his stomach drop. "So it's true. They wanted me to die." Marco nodded, continuing. "But that's not all. I was also able to track down the car that hit you that night. It was registered to a shell company, but with direct links to Clara's lover." Daniel's blood boiled. Everything was starting to make sense. Clara had not only betrayed him, but had engineered his accident to take everything he had. "This is what you needed, Daniel," Marco said, his voice firm. "This evidence is solid enough to take to the police. Clara and her lover are going to have to answer for this." Daniel took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief and anger. Finally, he had the proof he needed. But at the same time, he knew the battle was far from over. Clara wouldn't give up so easily. "We're going to bring them to justice," Daniel said, his voice firm. Natalie, who had been by his side the entire time, shook his hand. "We are with you." With the evidence in hand, Daniel knew the next step would be crucial. He needed to take everything to the police and ensure that Clara and her lover were held accountable for their crimes. The betrayal and the calculated plan to remove him from the scene were more serious than he imagined, but now he was armed with the necessary evidence. The next morning, Daniel and Natalie went to the Aspen police station, where they were greeted by Detective Harris, a robust man, with a tired look, but always attentive to details. Harris listened patiently as Daniel laid out the whole story: the accident, the betrayal, the bank transfers, and the connections between Clara and the man she was conspiring with. At the end of the explanation, Harris looked at Marco, who was next to Daniel, and leafed through the folder full of evidence. "That's a solid case," he said, in a deep voice. "I will need time to conduct a formal investigation, but from what I see here, we can issue an arrest warrant." Relief washed over Daniel, but he knew he was still far from ending this phase. He looked at Natalie, who gave him an encouraging smile. They had fought so hard to get here, and the idea that Clara would finally face the consequences of her actions gave her a sense of imminent justice. "How long until arrests?" Daniel asked, trying to remain calm. Harris shrugged. "It depends on how things turn out. They'll probably try to escape, so we have to act quickly. If the information Marco gathered is correct, we can catch them before they leave the city." The possibility that Clara and her lover were aware of the investigation worried him. He knew Clara was smart and manipulative. If she realized that the truth was close to being revealed, she would certainly run away. But this time, Daniel wasn't going to let her get away. As they waited for Harris to coordinate police action, Daniel felt the weight of waiting. He knew that every minute was crucial, but he also knew that, no matter how difficult it was, he needed to trust justice. Natalie, always by his side, helped calm him down. "You did what you needed to do, Daniel. Now it's a matter of time." Hours later, in the afternoon, Harris finally returned to the office with a determined look. "The warrants have been issued. We will now arrest Clara and her lover." Daniel nodded, but anxiety still burned in his chest. The thought of Clara being free, even for a short time, was unbearable. He had waited so long to get to this point that the tension seemed almost unbearable. But he knew that, finally, justice was on the move. Night had fallen over Aspen, but the police station was still busy. Harris and his team were ready for the operation. Clara and her lover were hiding in a chalet in the mountains, an off-the-records property that Marco was able to locate with his contacts. "This is it," Harris said, as he loaded his gun and organized the men. "Let's surround them and bring them back." Daniel, despite wanting to be present, was convinced by Natalie to wait at the police station. "Let them handle it," she said softly, touching his shoulder. "You've already done your part." He knew she was right, but that didn't make the wait any less difficult. The clock seemed to drag by, and every second made Daniel think about everything that had happened: Clara's betrayal, the accident, the attempt to steal his life. He couldn't shake the anger and pain it caused. Almost 2 hours later, the police station phone rang. Harris was on the other end of the line. "We got them. Clara and her lover are in custody." There was no resistance. Daniel exhaled, feeling a wave of relief. "What now?" he asked, trying to process what this meant. "Now," said Harris, "they will face serious charges. Conspiracy to murder, attempted fraud, among other crimes. It will take a while for this to come to court, but with the evidence you have brought, it is very likely that they will be arrested for a long time." After the call ended, Daniel felt like a ton of weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Finally, Clara was where she deserved to be, and the nightmare seemed to be coming to an end. He turned to Natalie, who smiled at him, as always, making him feel like everything was going to be okay. The next day, Daniel went to the police station to give his official statement. Marco was also there, finalizing the details of the case with Harris. "You did a good job, Daniel," Marco said, shaking Daniel's hand. "Not everyone can face something like this and come out stronger." "I had help," Daniel replied, looking at Natalie gratefully. The following weeks were intense. Clara and her lover faced their first hearings, and the local press soon discovered the scandal. Daniel's coffee chain was well known in the city, and the case quickly became headline news in Aspen. Despite all the exposure, Daniel kept his head high. He knew that with the evidence Marco had collected, justice was on his side. In court, Clara maintained a cold look, showing no regret. But as the evidence was presented and her lover testified in exchange for a lighter sentence, the case against her became irrefutable. Daniel watched in silence, trying not to let his emotions overwhelm him. He didn't want to feel angry anymore, he just wanted it all to end. When the judge finally handed down the verdict, finding Clara guilty of conspiracy and attempted murder, Daniel felt a wave of relief. Clara was sentenced to a long prison sentence, and her lover received a reduced sentence for collaborating with the investigation. Justice had been served, but the price Daniel paid for this betrayal was high. Upon leaving the court, Daniel was faced with a crowd of journalists and onlookers. He ignored them, focusing only on Natalie, who was waiting for him outside. "Is this the end?" she asked, her gaze worried. "It's the end of a part," said Daniel, looking at the horizon. "Now, it's time to start over." Natalie smiled and, for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he could finally put the past behind him. The morning silence in the Aspen Mountains was comforting. The cold air, the leaves still covered in a thin layer of dew, and the soft light that passed through the windows of Daniel's house seemed to herald the end of a long and painful journey. The weeks following Clara's trial brought a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Clara and her lover were arrested, the case was solved, and the shadow of betrayal had finally been removed from her life. But with this conclusion came the need to start over. Daniel looked at the kitchen table where he always started his day with a hot cup of coffee, feeling a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. He had his life back, but everything seemed different now. The house he had once shared with Clara was no longer the same. The memories still weighed heavily, and he knew that the true reconstruction began from within. Natalie, always by his side, was a constant rock. She had moved into Daniel's house after the trial, offering support and companionship as he found his footing. Little by little, the relationship between them stopped being just a partnership out of necessity, becoming something deeper, a connection built on respect, trust and the scars they both carried. "Is everything okay?" Natalie asked, sitting next to Daniel, who was looking out the window, lost in his thoughts. "Yes," he replied, turning to her with a slight smile. "I'm just trying to get used to it all. It feels surreal, you know? Having my life back after everything that happened." Natalie nodded. "It's normal. After going through something so intense, it takes a while to feel like things are really in place." Daniel looked at her, knowing how much she meant in this healing process. "I couldn't have done it without you." She smiled, squeezing his hand. "You would have, Daniel. You're stronger than you think. I just helped you remember that." They sat in silence for a few minutes, taking in the moment. But Daniel knew he couldn't remain suspended forever. He needed to get back to his professional life, get back to the routine he always loved, his cafes, his stores, and the people who trusted him over the years. "Today," said Daniel suddenly, "I'm going to the cafe." Natalie looked at him, surprised. "He is sure?" "Yes. It's time to go back. I need it." Later that morning, Daniel and Natalie went to the main location of their coffee chain in Aspen. As he walked through the door, he was greeted with spontaneous applause from his employees and customers. Everyone knew what had happened, and Daniel's return was seen as a triumph over adversity. Frank, his longtime manager, was the first to greet him. "It's good to have you back, boss," he said with a wide smile. "Things haven't been the same without you here." "It's good to be back," Daniel replied, feeling a surge of emotion. "But I know you guys held it together while I was gone. Thanks for that." Frank nodded proudly. "We're ready to get back into the swing of things." As he walked through the cafe, greeting staff and customers, Daniel felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in months. There, in the heart of the place he built with so much love and dedication, he found a piece of himself that he thought he had lost. As the days went by, Daniel slowly took back the reins of his life. He revamped the management of the cafes, integrating new ideas and methods to ensure the chain continued to prosper. But more important than that, he began to reconnect with the people around him, rebuilding the bonds that were almost destroyed by Clara's betrayal. A month after his return, Daniel organized a meeting with his core team, Frank, Anna, and the newly promoted Leo, the man who saved him in the accident and now managed the cafe's logistics. Everyone was in the meeting room, a small space with a view of the mountains, anxiously waiting for his next move. "I want to thank all of you for your unwavering support," Daniel began, looking at each person with a sincere smile. "This cafe, this chain, is more than just a business to me. It's a family, and you're all part of it." Frank nodded, knowing that Daniel's words came from the bottom of his heart. "We're ready to move forward, Daniel. Whatever you decide, we're with you." Daniel took a deep breath. "I've spent a lot of time reflecting on the future. On what I want for myself and for all of you. And the truth is, I want everyone to grow up with me. I'm not the same man I was before all this, and I think coffee needs to change too." Everyone exchanged curious glances. "Change how?" asked Leo, always direct. "I want each cafe unit to have more autonomy. You, the managers, will have more control over operations and decisions. I want each cafe to have its own identity, with the personal touch of whoever is in charge. Let's expand, yes, but in a more human way and connected to the values I've always had. Anna, who had shown her loyalty during the crisis, smiled. That's amazing, Daniel. I believe we can do this. I know we can, Daniel replied. And I'm not going to do this alone. We will all be part of this new phase. After the meeting, Daniel left the cafe with Natalie by his side. The sun was setting, and the mountains seemed to glow with a golden hue. He felt different, lighter, freer. For the first time, he looked to the future without the weight of the past. Clara's betrayal was no longer a shadow that followed him. It was a lesson, something he overcame with strength, courage and the help of people he could trust. So what's next? Natalie asked as they walked back home. Daniel smiled. Now, we build. Not just the cafe, but a new life. Together. She smiled back, knowing that despite all the challenges they had faced, the future was finally open and bright for both of them. They had found peace amidst the chaos, and together they were ready to face anything that came their way. The gentle wind from the mountains enveloped them, and in that moment, Daniel knew he had won. It was not just the battle for justice, but victory over his own doubts and fears. With Natalie, his team, and his friends by his side, he was ready for whatever the future brought.